The rope burns on 8-year-old Clara Winslow's wrists still wept blood as she stumbled down Red Mesa's dusty main street, her bare feet leaving crimson prints in the alkaline soil. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the chaos raging inside her mind, fractured thoughts that refused to connect, images that flickered and vanished like dying embers. Mama's face when they put the rope around her neck. The way her eyes found mine in the crowd, trying to say something, trying to tell me to run. But I couldn't move. I couldn't. The Wyoming sun beat down mercilessly, turning the air into shimmering waves that made the 3 bodies swaying from the hanging tree look like dark mirages against the bleached sky. Her mother's blue dress, the one with tiny yellow flowers that Clara had always loved, hung torn and stained. Her father's boots, the same ones he'd worn every morning to the mine, pointed toward the unforgiving earth. Her brother Tommy's small hands, which had taught her to skip stones just last week, hung forever stilled. Papa said to be brave. Papa said to remember where he hid the papers. Important papers. But why can't I remember? Why does everything feel like looking through water? Sheriff Orville Sykes stood on the courthouse steps, his silver badge catching the harsh light, a 5-pointed star with distinctive scratches that formed the crude outline of a fish. Those scratches had been carved years ago by small, grateful fingers, though the sheriff had long since forgotten their origin and the debt they represented. "Look at her," someone whispered from the boardwalk outside Murphy's saloon. "Walking around like she don't even know where she is. Poor little thing." Another voice replied, but nobody moved to help. They had learned the price of crossing Sheriff Sykes in a territory where law came from gun barrels and gold bought justice. Clara's blue eyes, once bright with childhood wonder, now held the fractured gaze of someone who had witnessed horrors beyond comprehension. Each step sent fresh fire through the rope burns on her ankles, and her torn fingernails bloodied from clawing at the noose before they'd thrown her clear, left small red smears on her calico dress. The smell of hemp rope, the scratch of it against my neck. I can still feel it there like a collar I can't take off. Why did they let me live? Why didn't they finish what they started? Only the chaos of a spooked horse had saved her thrown clear when the animal reared at the smell of blood, giving her precious seconds to slip into the crowd before anyone noticed the smallest. Winslow still breathed. Now she collapsed beside Henderson's blacksmith shop, her small body folding into the dust like a broken doll consciousness, dimming at the edges as shock finally claimed its due. From the shadows between adobe buildings, dark eyes watched every movement with growing internal conflict. The man was called Nesotavo, by his people stands alone, in the Cheyenne tongue. At 32, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a warrior who had survived the brutal conflicts that swept across the plains like grass fires. He had come to trade buffalo hides for ammunition and coffee, conducting business at Murphy's General Store that morning. A simple transaction meant to be completed quickly and quietly before leaving this place of tension and barely contained violence. He understood the rules: speak little, avoid attention, be gone before sunset brought out the worst in men's hearts. I should walk away. This is not my fight, not my people. I have seen enough white man's cruelty to fill a lifetime. Every time I involve myself in their affairs, blood follows. But the child's broken walk tugged at something deeper than prudence. In her stumbling gait, he saw Ayanna, sweet Ayanna, with her musical laugh and gentle hands, who had been only 9 when the soldiers came with their torches and their righteous fury. His sister, who had died screaming his name, while he fought other battles protecting other people, believing he was being a hero. I failed her. I was elsewhere when she needed me most, chasing glory while she burned. I will not fail another innocent, not while I still draw breath. The warrior's hands clenched into fists as memory washed over him, and the smell of burning lodges, the sound of children's screams, the way Ayanna had looked at him with such trust during their last conversation, never imagining it would be their final words. She had been planning to gather berries that morning, excited about a new song she wanted to teach him. "Brother, listen." she had said, clapping her small hands. "I made up a song about the morning star. Do you want to hear it?" But I was busy sharpening arrows, preparing for a raid against the crow. "Later, little sister," I told her. "When I return, you can sing all the songs you want." He never returned. By the time the war party rode back to their village, there was nothing left but ashes and unmarked graves. Now watching Clara crumble in the dust, while townspeople stepped around her like she carried plague, Nesotavo felt the weight of choice settling on his shoulders like a war shirt. He could walk away, should walk away. Return to his people, report what he had seen, let white men's justice follow its bloody course, or he could act and probably die for it. Ayana, he thought, touching the small medicine bundle at his neck, where he carried a lock of his sister's hair, "Guide my feet. Help me choose better this time." The warrior stepped from the shadows. "Child," he said quietly, kneeling beside Clara's crumpled form. "You are hurt." Clara looked up through tear-streaked dirt, her vision swimming with shock and dehydration. Through the haze, she saw a man with kind eyes, despite his fearsome appearance, painted features, braided hair, adorned with feathers, buckskin clothing that marked him as utterly foreign to her sheltered world. They killed my family," she whispered, her voice breaking like glass. The words felt strange in her mouth, too large and terrible to be real. "I know. I saw." Nesotavo's voice carried no judgment, only truth spoken gently. His eyes took in the rope burns, the torn dress, the way she held herself like every breath hurt. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though her legs trembled like a newborn foal's. He helped her stand, noting how she favored her left ankle, where the rope had burned through skin, how she unconsciously touched her throat, where phantom pressure still lingered. Around them, townspeople hurried past, with averted eyes, some from shame, others from fear, most from the simple human desire to avoid involvement in another's tragedy. A few cast suspicious glances at the Cheyenne warrior hands, drifting toward concealed weapons, but none challenged his presence openly. "Why won't anyone help me?" Clara asked, confusion mixing with grief, as she watched a woman she recognized from church services cross the street to avoid them. "Because they fear your sheriff more than they value their own souls," Nesotavo replied honestly. "People who help his enemies become enemies themselves, and most men prize their own safety above all else. But I'm not an enemy. I'm just 8 years old." The words came out as a wail, the first real emotion she'd shown since the hangings. To men like Sykes, anyone who threatens their power is an enemy, regardless of age or innocence. He studied her pale face, seeing intelligence behind the shock strength beneath the fragility. "What is your name?" "Clara Winslow. My papa owned the Lucky Strike claim up by Willow Creek." Fresh tears carved paths through the dirt on her cheeks. "Mama said never talk to strangers, but she's... Your mother was wise, but sometimes strangers are all we have left." Nesotavo glanced around, noting watching eyes from doorways and windows. The sun was climbing higher, and his presence here was drawing attention he couldn't afford. "You cannot stay here. Do you understand?" Clara nodded slowly, the practical part of her mind beginning to function despite the trauma. "They're going to kill me too, aren't they? Like they killed my family." The warrior's jaw tightened. In his culture, children were sacred, protected by the entire tribe, never harmed, regardless of their parents' actions. But white man's justice followed different rules, colder calculations. "Not while I breathe," he said simply, and something in his tone made Clara believe him. By nightfall, Clara sat in the jail's single cell, her small form lost in shadows cast by a flickering oil lamp. The stone walls bore dark stains from previous occupants' suffering, and somewhere in the darkness, rats scratched at loose mortar with tiny claws. The smell of unwashed bodies and human waste made her stomach churn, but she had nothing left to vomit. "Papa's papers?" She thought her hand going instinctively to the spot beneath her dress where the oilskin packet lay hidden. He said to keep them safe. Said they were proof of our innocence. But what good is proof when the people who need to see it are the ones trying to kill you? Sheriff Sykes emerged from his office with deputies Tom Fletcher and Jack Morrison. Fletcher was a lean man in his early 20s with pale eyes and nervous habits, constantly adjusting his gun belt, running fingers through sandy hair. In the lamplight, something about his profile triggered a memory Nesotavo couldn't quite grasp, a familiarity that danced just beyond recognition. Those eyes Nesotavo thought from his hiding place beneath the jail's window. Blue as winter ice, and that way he holds his left shoulder slightly higher than his right. I have seen this before, but where? Time to clean up loose ends. Sykes muttered, working tobacco between stained teeth. Girl's got to disappear permanent-like. Can't have her telling tales to territorial marshals or anyone else with authority to ask uncomfortable questions. Where are we taking her? Fletcher asked, his voice carrying a slight tremor. Despite his badge, he seemed uncomfortable with the task ahead, not from moral qualms, but from the jittery nervousness of someone still new to murder. Old mine shaft up Devil's Canyon. Deep enough that a body won't be found till Judgment Day, and even then folks will figure she got lost running from the hangings. Sykes spat into the dust, the brown stream reflecting lamplight. Just another tragedy in a violent territory. Clara pressed herself into the cell's corner, understanding enough to know these men planned her death. She wanted to cry, to scream for help, but terror had frozen her vocal cords, leaving only the terrible understanding that her family's killers meant to finish what they'd started. Mama always said to pray when I was scared. But what if God isn't listening? What if he's busy somewhere else? Like Nesotavo said his spirits were when his sister died. They dragged her from the cell, her bare feet scraping against rough planks, worn smooth by countless other victims. A covered wagon waited in the alley. Like a hearse, its canvas top stretched tight over wooden ribs that looked disturbingly like a skeleton in the lamplight. As Fletcher and Morrison positioned themselves around the wagon, Clara caught a glimpse of something that made her heart skip movement in the shadows beyond the alley. A flash of buckskin and feathers that meant her unlikely protector hadn't abandoned her after all. But other ears had heard their plan with growing fury. Nesotavo crouched beneath the jail's window, every word burning into his memory like cattle brands on hide. He had spent the afternoon studying the town's layout, noting every alley and escape route, every building that might offer cover or concealment. His paint stallion waited saddled behind Henderson's smithy, ready for rapid departure, its hooves wrapped in strips of hide to muffle sound. 3 armed men against 1 warrior. Poor odds, but I have faced worse. His hand found the war club at his belt, fingers tracing the familiar weight of ironwood and riverstones. The element of surprise will not last long. I must strike hard and fast, then flee before the entire town rouses against us. As the deputies positioned themselves around the wagon, Nesotavo made his final preparations. He touched the medicine bundle at his throat, whispering a brief prayer to the spirits of his ancestors, then drew his knife and tested its edge against his thumb. Sharp enough to cut through rope or flesh with equal ease. Ayana, watch over me. Guide my hands and feet. Let me succeed where I failed before. The warrior struck like summer lightning, splitting dark sky. His war club, carved from ironwood and weighted with river stones, caught Fletcher behind the ear with a sound like breaking kindling. The deputy collapsed without a whisper, blood pooling in dust that drank it greedily. Morrison spun toward the noise hand, diving for his gun. But Nesotavo was already inside his reach, moving with the fluid grace of a predator born to hunt. The warrior's knee drove up into Morrison's stomach, folding him like a broken hinge. Then, an elbow to the spine dropped him beside his partner. Both men would live, but they would carry this night's aches for years to come, assuming they lived to see morning. What in hell? Sykes began, then froze, as he found himself staring into eyes that held no fear, no hesitation. Only the cold promise of measured violence. Release the child, Nesotavo said in careful English, his accent thick, but his meaning crystal clear. Sykes clawed for his holstered Colt desperation, making him clumsy. But Nesotavo was faster his movements, economical and precise. The war club's handle caught the sheriff's wrist with bone-jarring force, sending the pistol spinning into shadows, where it clattered against the alley wall. A precisely placed blow to the temple sent Sykes to his knees. Consciousness fled like smoke on desert wind. Clara stared at her rescuer with wonder, slowly replacing terror. "You're the Indian man, from the trading post," she whispered, hardly daring to believe rescue had come from such an unexpected source. "My name is Nesotavo. Can you ride?" She nodded, though her legs shook like grass in prairie wind. Fear and relief warred in her chest, making it hard to breathe normally. "Then we ride now before they wake and raise half the territory against us." He lifted her onto his stallion's back, noting how light she felt, too light for a growing child. Her bones sharp beneath skin that spoke of recent hunger. Behind them, shouts erupted as townspeople began investigating the commotion. By the time Sykes groaned back to consciousness, blood trickling from his scalp, warrior and child had vanished into Wyoming darkness, like spirits returning to the earth from which they came. The Badlands stretched endlessly under star-scattered sky, a maze of wind-carved stone and hidden arroyos that could swallow travelers without trace. Ancient waters had carved fantastic sculptures from red sandstone pillars that looked like giants in the moonlight, arches that framed distant mountains, canyons that dropped into darkness deeper than night itself. Nesotavo guided his horse through paths known to his people for generations, following game trails and water sources that white men had never discovered. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew, like approaching thunder, punctuated by Sykes's voice, howling orders across the broken landscape. Clara clung to his buckskin shirt, her small arms wrapped around his waist with desperate strength. The rope burns on her wrists had reopened during their escape, staining his clothing with fresh blood. But she made no complaint. Fear was teaching her hard lessons about endurance, about the price of survival, in a world suddenly turned hostile. "Are they still following us?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats on stone. "Yes. Sykes has offered money for our capture, more money than most of these men see in a year." Nesotavo kept his voice calm, though he could hear the posse spreading out behind them, at least a dozen riders now. "Men will ride far for gold, even through dangerous country." "How much money?" $50 last I heard. Enough to feed a family through winter or buy a man's conscience for a few months. Clara was quiet for a moment, processing this with the stark clarity that trauma sometimes brings to children. "That's more than Papa made in 2 months mining. And he worked every day, except Sundays. Your father was an honest man. Honest work pays poorly compared to theft and murder." The bitter truth of it settled over them like alkali dust. But honest work lets a man sleep peacefully, which is worth more than gold to those wise enough to understand. As they rode deeper into the labyrinth of stone, Nesotavo began employing the evasion tactics learned during years of warfare. He guided his horse up a narrow wash, then doubled back along a parallel ridge, leaving false trails that would confuse pursuers. When they reached a creek cutting through red sandstone, he urged the stallion into the water, knowing the current would hide their tracks, but cost precious time. Clara shivered as icy water soaked through her torn dress, the cold shocking after the day's heat. "Tell me about your family," Nesotavo said, partly to distract her from discomfort and fear, partly because he needed to understand the forces arrayed against them. "Papa came here from Missouri after the gold was found. Said we could make a new life where a man's work mattered more than his name or how much money his family had." Clara's voice grew smaller as memory brought both comfort and pain. "Mama didn't want to leave her sister, but Papa said opportunity doesn't wait for anyone willing to work hard. Your father was wise about opportunity. less wise about this place welcoming honest work. Nesotavo guided his horse around a submerged boulder, feeling the animal's muscles strain against the current. Men like Sykes see newcomers as either threats to eliminate or resources to exploit. Sheriff Sykes came to our house 3 weeks ago. Wanted Papa to sign papers giving up our claim. Papa said the claim was legal bought fair from the territorial office with money he'd saved for 5 years. Clara's voice dropped, remembering the fear in her mother's eyes that day. That's when Sykes got mean. Nesotavo felt pieces of the puzzle falling into place. What did Sykes say exactly? Said Papa would be sorry for not cooperating. Said he'd make Papa look like a thief and a traitor, and nobody questions what happens to thieves and traitors in Red Mesa. Clara's small hands clenched into fists. Papa tried to reason with him, said we were all Americans here, all trying to make honest livings. But Sykes just laughed and said the only law in Red Mesa was what he said it was. Behind them, torchlight flickered between stone pillars as the posse worked to follow their trail. Sykes's voice echoed off canyon walls distorted by distance and anger. Find them. I want that redskin's scalp and the girl's body before sunrise. Papa found papers in Sykes's office that night. Clara continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Fake bills of sale, forged signatures documents that made it look like we were selling our claim to foreign miners. Papa said it was all lies, that Sykes was planning to steal our mine and needed evidence of wrongdoing to justify it. Where are these papers now? Clara's hand went to something hidden beneath her dress, pressed against her ribs, where it wouldn't be easily found. Papa gave them to me before the men came. Said to keep them safe no matter what happened. Said they were our only proof of innocence, and that if anything happened to our family, I should find a way to get them to someone who could help. Someone, Marshal Garrett in Cheyenne City. Papa said he was one of the few honest lawmen left in the territory, someone who couldn't be bought or frightened into silence. Tears began flowing again as Clara remembered her father's desperate urgency that final night. Papa knew something terrible was going to happen, didn't he? Your father was wiser than he knew. Nesotavo replied grimly. He prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. That wisdom may be what saves your life. As they emerged from the creek onto a rocky flat where their tracks would be harder to follow, a new sound reached them, the distant howl of a wolf answered by another from a different direction. But Nesotavo's trained ear detected something artificial in the calls, a subtle wrongness that spoke of human throats rather than animal voices. They're using signals, he said quietly, coordinating their search pattern like hunters driving game toward a trap. Clara pressed closer to his back, feeling the tension in his muscles. What do we do? What hunted animals have always done, find better ground to make our stand. Ahead of them, the creek led to a box canyon with walls too steep for horses' sanctuary and trap combined. A waterfall dropped 40 feet from the mesa, above its silver cascade, catching starlight like scattered diamonds. The sound of falling water would mask their voices, but it would also prevent them from hearing approaching enemies until too late. No way out but back. Clara observed with the practical clarity that sometimes comes to children in crisis. Sometimes the only way forward is through the impossible. Nesotavo replied, studying the canyon walls with tactical eyes. Already he was noting potential defensive positions, calculating fields of fire planning for the battle he knew was coming. Torchlight flickered at the canyon mouth like malevolent fireflies. Their pursuers had found the trail and were closing in with the methodical patience of experienced manhunters. Spread out. Sykes commanded, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. They're trapped like rats in a barrel. No way out but through us. Nesotavo slid from his horse and lifted Clara down, noting how she automatically positioned herself behind the animal for cover. Fear was teaching her survival instincts. Her parents had never needed to explain lessons learned in blood and terror that no child should have to master. His rifle, a Henry repeater acquired through trade with a deserting cavalry trooper, came to his hands with practiced ease. He checked the loading gate, counting cartridges by touch. 15 shots before he would need to reload, and perhaps 30 seconds to accomplish that under fire. 15 men against one warrior and a child. Poor odds, but he had faced worse during the Indian Wars. "Stay behind the horse," he instructed, his voice calm, despite their desperate situation. "When I say run, go to the water." "Can you swim?" "Yes, but it looks really deep," Clara replied, studying the dark pool with 8-year-old uncertainty. "Deep enough to hide us from their bullets. Trust me, little one. The water will not harm you if you do not panic." The first shot came from Morrison, recovered enough from his beating to want revenge. His bullet sparked off stone near Nesotavo's head, sending granite chips spinning into darkness. The sharp crack echoed off canyon walls, officially beginning a battle that would end with blood on stone. The warrior's answering shot was more precise, aimed with the careful marksmanship of someone who had learned that ammunition was precious, and every bullet must count. Morrison spun and fell, clutching a shattered shoulder, while his blood darkened the dust beneath him. "He's only got one gun," Sykes shouted, trying to rally his volunteers. "Rush him $50 to the man who brings me that redskin's scalp." But Nesotavo understood tactics better than most professional soldiers. He dropped behind a boulder, worn smooth by ancient floods, then rose to fire again before ducking back into cover. His second shot dropped the lead horse, sending its rider tumbling into a patch of prickly pear cactus. The wounded animal's screams spooked the other mounts, breaking the charge into confusion, as men fought to control panicked horses on treacherous ground. 14 shots left. Nesotavo counted grimly, watching the posse regroup beyond effective range. Not enough to kill them all, but perhaps enough to make them cautious. While the attackers struggled to control their mounts, Nesotavo studied the canyon's defensive possibilities. The walls were too steep for flanking attacks, which meant any assault would have to come straight at his position. But the narrow confines also limited his movement, and eventually they would either overwhelm him through sheer numbers or force him to exhaust his ammunition. "The water, Clara," he said quietly. "Move now while they're distracted." She ran like a startled deer, her bare feet silent on stone, worn smooth by countless flash floods. Nesotavo covered her retreat with methodical shots that kept the posse pinned while she reached the pool's edge. Then he followed, diving deep as bullets churned the surface into foam. The water was shockingly cold, fed by mountain snow that never completely melted, even in summer's heat. Clara surfaced beside him, gasping but alive, her blonde hair darkened to brown by the mineral-rich water. Above them, torch beams swept the pool like searching fingers, while frustrated voices cursed the darkness. "They're in the water," someone yelled. "Light it up, pour every bullet we've got into that pool." Lead rained down like deadly hail, but water deflected most shots harmlessly into the rocky bottom. Nesotavo found an underwater ledge where they could breathe while staying hidden. And there they waited as the posse emptied their weapons into empty darkness, the sound of gunfire echoing off stone walls like thunder in a bottle. "A waste of ammunition," Sykes growled finally, his voice thick with frustration and growing desperation. "They'll have to come up eventually to breathe. Post guards at both ends and wait for dawn." But morning brought sounds that chilled Sykes to the bone. The distant call of retreat, as his volunteers decided $50 wasn't worth dying for when the shooting got serious. Men had families and legitimate work-waiting responsibilities that mattered more than a corrupt sheriff's vengeance. As sunrise painted the canyon walls gold and crimson, only Sykes and his 2 conscious deputies remained to continue the hunt. But they had persistence born of desperation, knowing that failure here would mean exposure of crimes that stretched far beyond simple land grabbing. Nesotavo and Clara emerged from their cold refuge like creatures reborn from the depths. They were alive, but hypothermia had taken its toll. Clara's lips had turned blue, and Nesotavo could feel the dangerous lethargy that preceded unconsciousness. The real test was just beginning. They found shelter in a cave hidden behind the waterfall, a natural sanctuary known to Cheyenne hunters for generations. Water cascaded past the entrance like a silver curtain, while inside ancient pictographs told stories of warriors and spirits of hunts, both successful and tragic. Warming springs heated the air, and the stone walls provided insulation against the desert's temperature extremes. "These are your people's pictures?" Clara asked, studying the painted figures with wonder as feeling returned to her numbed limbs. "Stories painted by my ancestors." Nesotavo replied, settling beside her on a flat stone worn smooth by countless previous occupants. "That one shows the great buffalo hunt of 7 winters past. My grandfather led that hunt, fed the whole band through the winter, when game was scarce and the snows came early." Clara leaned forward, fascinated despite their desperate circumstances. The warmth of the cave and the mesmerizing artwork provided a brief respite from fear. "Tell me about buffalo hunting." Buffalo are not just animals to the Cheyenne. They are relatives' gifts from the Creator. Every part serves a purpose: meat for food, hides for shelter, bones for tools, sinew for thread. A good hunt requires patience, skill, and most importantly, respect for what you take. "How do you hunt something so big? They must be bigger than Papa's wagon." "Much bigger. And they may look slow, but they can outrun horses over short distances. They're also dangerous when cornered. A bull buffalo can kill a mounted warrior with one charge, gore a horse and rider both." Clara's eyes widened with mixture of fear and fascination. "Have you ever been charged by a buffalo?" "Once. I was 14, eager to prove myself a man among the warriors. Got too close to a wounded bull, thinking I could show off my courage." Nesotavo chuckled at the memory, the sound echoing softly in their stone sanctuary. "Spent 3 days up a cottonwood tree, while that old bull waited for me to come down, scratching his horns on the bark and snorting at me every few hours." "Oh, what happened? How did you get down?" "My uncle finally shot the bull with arrows from long range. Then he made me skin the entire animal by myself as punishment for showing off. Said young warriors who try to impress others instead of doing their job become dead warriors very quickly." Clara giggled, the first truly happy sound she'd made since the hangings. The normalcy of storytelling, the gentle humor in Nesotavo's voice, provided an anchor point in a world that had become unrecognizable. "That sounds like something Mama would say. She always told Tommy and me that being brave and being stupid weren't the same thing. Your mother was wise. Real courage is knowing when to fight and when to run, when to speak and when to listen. It's about protecting what matters, not proving how fearless you are." As Clara explored the cave, examining pictographs and collecting pretty stones that caught the filtered light, Nesotavo tended her wounds with herbs from his medicine bundle. He cleaned the rope burns with water from the natural spring, then applied a poultice made from plants his grandmother had taught him to recognize. "This stings," Clara complained as he bandaged her wrists with strips of soft buckskin. "Pain means healing is beginning," he replied gently, his large hands surprisingly tender as they worked. "These marks will fade with time, but they will remind you that you survived something terrible, that you were stronger than those who tried to break you. Will I always have these scars? Perhaps. But scars are not always ugly things. Sometimes they are proof that we lived through what should have killed us." Nesotavo finished wrapping her wrists, then moved to examine her rope-burned ankles. "Among my people's scars earned in honorable battle are worn with pride." Clara was quiet for a moment, absorbing this new way of thinking about her injuries. "Nesotavo, why did you save me? You don't even know me, and helping me puts you in danger." The warrior paused in his work, considering how to answer without burdening her with his own grief. 3 winters ago, I had a sister. She was 9 years old, almost your age. Her name was Ayana, which means eternal blossom in our tongue. What happened to her? When soldiers burned our village, I tried to save her. But I was fighting other battles, protecting other people, chasing what I thought was glory. By the time I reached her lodge, it was too late. His voice carried old pain, carefully controlled, but never entirely absent. She died in the flames while I was elsewhere, thinking I was being a hero. Clara reached out and touched his hand with small fingers. I'm sorry about your sister. Thank you, little one. I failed her when she needed me most. But perhaps protecting you honors her memory. Perhaps it proves that grief can create hope instead of only hatred. Tell me more about Ayanna, Clara said softly. What was she like? Nesotovo smiled, memory bringing both pain and warmth. She was always singing. Made up songs about everything, the way morning light looked on water, how the wind sounded in different seasons, silly songs about our grandmother's cooking that made everyone laugh. She wanted to be a storyteller when she grew up, to travel between bands and share news and tales. Did she look like you? She had our mother's features smaller, more delicate. But she had our father's stubbornness. Once she decided something was right, nothing could change her mind. She used to argue with the elders about why women couldn't hunt with the men, why children had to do all the boring work while adults got to do exciting things. Clara giggled again. She sounds like she would have been fun to know. She would have liked you, I think. You have the same kind of spirit, afraid, but not broken, sad, but not defeated. Nesotavo's eyes grew distant. The last thing she said to me was about a song she wanted to teach me when I returned from the raid. I told her we would have time for songs later, after more important things were finished. I was wrong. There is always time for songs, because songs are what make us human. They spent the day resting and healing, sharing stories that built bridges between their different worlds. Nesotavo taught Clara to recognize edible plants and read animal tracks in the dust. She showed him how to braid grass the way her mother had taught her, and sang songs her family had shared around their cabin's fireplace on cold winter nights. My papa used to say that every person leaves tracks, Clara said, as they practiced reading signs in the cave's sandy floor. Not just in mud or dust, but in other people's hearts. He said the most important question wasn't how much gold you found, but what kind of tracks you left behind. Your father was wise. What kind of tracks do you want to leave, Clara? She considered this seriously, her young face thoughtful in the filtered light. Good ones. The kind that help people instead of hurting them. Like the tracks you're leaving in my heart right now. As evening approached, new sounds reached them from outside, hoofbeats and voices, but different from the earlier pursuit. These weren't the rough calls of angry volunteers, but the measured speech of men conducting organized professional business. Nesotovo crept to the cave entrance and peered through the waterfall's mist. What he saw made his blood run cold. Sheriff Sykes had returned with professional help, 4 hard-faced men with a look of seasoned killers about them, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Their leader was a scarred man named Dutch Kessler, who wore twin colts and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. Silver conchos decorated his hatband, and a gold tooth gleamed when he smiled, which he did often, but never with warmth. His clothes were expensive but practical, marking him as successful in his deadly profession. Trail goes cold at the water. Dutch announced, studying tracks with expert eyes that missed nothing. But they didn't sprout wings and fly away. Cave behind that waterfall looks mighty promising. Could be. Sykes agreed, his voice tight with frustration and growing desperation. That redskin fights like 10 men, but he's still just 1 gun against 6 now. And the girl's slowing him down. Kid that age can't travel far or fast. Makes them predictable, added another bounty hunter, a lean man with dead eyes. Wounded animal with a cub always goes to ground in the first defensible position. Question is whether we smoke them out or wait for thirst to do our work. What the hunters didn't notice was smoke rising from the distant mesa, a signal fire lit by Cheyenne scouts who'd seen armed whites entering sacred hunting grounds. Help was coming, but its nature and timing remained uncertain. Inside the cave, Clara pressed close to Nesotavo as shadows moved beyond the water curtain. Who are those men? They don't sound like the others. Not bounty hunters. Men who kill for money rather than law or justice. Nesotavo checked his rifle's remaining ammunition, 6 rounds left, and no spare cartridges in his pack. They have no honor to limit their actions, no conscience to make them hesitate. They are the most dangerous kind of enemy. Will they hurt me? Not while I live. He promised, though the odds suggested his life might not last much longer against professional killers. Clara was quiet for a moment, then asked with the directness that children sometimes show in crisis, "If something happens to you, what should I do?" The question struck like a physical blow. This 8-year-old child was already planning for his death, accepting the possibility with the grim practicality that frontier life taught early and harshly. "There's a crack in the back wall," he said, finally pointing toward a shadow he had taken for natural darkness. "Narrow passage leads to tunnels that connect to other caves. If I fall, you run through there and keep running until you reach daylight on the other side of the mesa. I don't want to leave you. Sometimes we must do things we don't want to do. That's part of growing up, part of surviving." He touched her face gently, seeing Ayana's features superimposed over her own. "But do not give up hope too quickly. I am not easy to kill, and you are stronger than you know." Outside, Dutch Kessler was making his approach. The bounty hunters moved with practiced coordination, spreading out to cover all angles, while their leader prepared for negotiation from a position of strength. "Come on out, Chief." Dutch called his voice, carrying mock friendliness. "Let's discuss this like civilized men." "That's far enough." Nesotavo replied from behind his boulder rifle, trained on the cave entrance. "Easy now. Just want to talk business." Dutch stepped into the open hands, raised in false peace, while his men took concealed firing positions. "See, we've been learning all about you, Nesotavo of the Cheyenne. Real interesting story you got there." Nesotavo kept his rifle steady while unease crept up his spine like cold fingers. Something in the bounty hunter's tone suggested more than simple pursuit for money. "Sheriff Sykes has been telling us tales about your past." Dutch continued conversationally, his scarred face wearing a predatory grin. "About how you murdered his deputies, kidnapped that innocent child. But he also mentioned something else, something that makes this whole situation mighty curious from where I'm standing." Behind Dutch, his men shifted positions like wolves circling wounded prey. But Nesotavo maintained his focus on their leader, recognizing the psychological warfare beginning. "About 5 years back." Dutch said, his grin turning wider and more cruel. "Sykes had himself a boy. Tommy Fletcher was the name, cute kid, maybe 6 years old when he had his little accident." The name hit Nesotavo like a physical blow, triggering memories he had tried to bury. Winter morning, ice-covered creek, a child's terrified screams as frigid water closed over his head. The desperate dive into freezing current, lungs burning as he fought to reach the drowning boy. "That's right," Dutch said, noting the recognition dawning in his target's eyes. "Little Tommy fell through ice on Morgan Creek one winter day. Would have drowned for sure, turned into just another sad story about frontier dangers, if not for a certain Cheyenne warrior who happened to be trading nearby." The memory came flooding back with devastating clarity, pulling Tommy's limp body from the water, breathing life back into blue lips, while his heart hammered with desperate hope. The boy's first gasping breath, the way his eyes had focused with returning consciousness. And afterward, Sheriff Sykes kneeling in the snow, weeping with gratitude while promising eternal debt. "You saved Sheriff Sykes's boy." Dutch continued with a sadistic pleasure. "Pulled him out of that creek and brought him back to life, while his daddy knelt there crying and swearing he'd never forget what you did for his family. And how does old Sykes repay that sacred debt? By putting a price on your head for protecting another child. The betrayal cut deeper than any bullet could. Sykes wasn't just another corrupt lawman. He was a man who'd forgotten the most fundamental obligation, who'd turned against someone who'd saved his son's life. The depth of that moral corruption was breathtaking. But Dutch wasn't finished with his psychological assault. Here's the really sweet part, though. He added, his gold tooth glinting in the fading light. That boy you saved, he grew up real nice, learned to wear a badge and follow his daddy's orders. Became Deputy Tom Fletcher, one of the men who helped hang that little girl's family yesterday. The revelation crashed over Nesotavo like an avalanche, pieces of terrible irony falling into place. The pale-eyed deputy, whose face had seemed familiar, it was Tommy, the drowning child he'd rescued. The boy whose life he'd saved had grown up to help murder innocents, to become part of the machinery that destroyed families. Of course, young Tommy ain't really dead like we've been telling folks around town. Dutch added with mounting cruelty. Took a good knock on the head from your war club, but he's walking around just fine. Sheriff just wanted to make you sound worse. Killing a man who owed you his life makes for much better storytelling when you're trying to work up a lynch mob. Clara gasped from her position deeper in the cave, understanding enough to grasp the monstrous betrayal being revealed. Nesotavo's rifle wavered as the full weight of cosmic irony crashed down on him like falling stone. The psychological warfare achieved its intended purpose. For one crucial moment, Nesotavo hesitated, his mind reeling from layers of betrayal and bitter revelation. In that instant of vulnerability, Dutch's partner Billy Santos stepped from concealment behind a boulder and fired. The bullet caught Nesotavo in the left shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him behind his meager cover. Blood flowed freely from the wound, darkening his buckskin shirt and weakening him with each heartbeat. The impact felt like being kicked by a horse, hot iron piercing flesh and grinding against bone. Clara was his first coherent thought through the haze of pain. Must protect Clara. Cannot fail again. Now that's what I call progress. Dutch laughed, drawing his own pistol as crimson began pooling in the dust. Come on out, Chief. You're bleeding like a stuck pig and we've got all day to wait. But even as the bounty hunters prepared to close in for the kill, salvation arrived, with wild war cries echoing off canyon walls like voices of ancient spirits. A dozen Cheyenne warriors swept down from the mesa tops, their faces painted for battle and their voices raised in songs that had terrified enemies for generations. Billy Santos died with a Cheyenne arrow through his heart, never seeing the warrior who killed him. The steel point punched through his back and emerged from his chest with surgical precision, dropping him face first into the rocky pool where his blood began to darken the clear water. Dutch spun toward this new threat. As more war cries bounced between stone walls, his confidence evaporating as rapidly as morning dew under desert sun. What the hell? The war party was led by Maka, Nesotavo's younger brother, a fierce warrior, whose hatred for whites burned like grass fire, consuming everything in its path. His face bore ritual scars from mourning their sister's death in a cavalry raid, and his voice carried the bitter edge of grief that had never fully healed. Brother Maka called in rapid Cheyenne as he reached the cave entrance. Why do you protect the white child? Let her die with her own kind. They are all the same destroyers of everything sacred. The philosophical divide between brothers ran as deep as canyon walls carved by ancient floods. Nesotavo believed in judging individuals by their actions rather than their blood, while Maka saw only enemies and allies, with no middle ground for mercy or redemption. She is innocent, Nesotavo replied through gritted teeth, struggling to his feet, despite the shoulder wound that sent lightning bolts of agony down his arm. She has committed no crimes, harmed no one. Innocent. Maka's voice cracked with accumulated pain and rage. What innocence did they show when soldiers burned our sister alive in her wedding dress? What mercy when they poisoned our grandfather's waterhole because he refused to move to their reservation? While the brothers debated in their native tongue, Dutch Kessler made his desperate move. Trapped between Cheyenne warriors above and canyon walls behind, with his partners dead or dying around him, he lunged for the one asset that might buy him life, Clara herself. The child was trying to help bandage Nesotavo's wound with strips torn from her dress, when Dutch grabbed her from behind his knife, pressing against her throat as she struggled in his grip. The blade was sharp enough to draw a thin line of blood where it touched her skin. "Everyone back off." Dutch shouted, his voice cracking with desperation and fury. "I'll cut her throat wide open and watch her bleed out in the dust." The Cheyenne warriors paused, uncertainly, arrows nocked but not yet released. Makah's eyes met his brother's across the rocky space, seeing the impossible choice reflected there, like images in dark water. For a long moment, time seemed suspended between heartbeats. Clara's frightened breathing, the whisper of wind through stone passages, the distant call of a hunting hawk, all the small sounds that mark the difference between life and death. Then Makah spoke, his voice cold as winter stone. "She means nothing to us, white man. Kill her if you wish. We came for my brother, not to save the spawn of our enemies." But Makah had underestimated both the child and the lessons she had learned from watching her protector. Instead of freezing with terror, as Dutch expected, Clara began to cry, not the quiet tears of earlier, but the loud, piercing wails that only children could produce when they truly committed to the performance. The sound echoed off canyon walls like a banshee's shriek, so startling and disorienting that Dutch instinctively loosened his grip. In that moment of distraction, Clara employed the tactic Nesotavo had used against the buffalo. She suddenly went completely limp in her captor's arms, forcing him to support her full dead weight or let her fall. The unexpected burden threw Dutch off balance, his knife hand wavering away from her throat as he struggled to maintain his hold. Clara twisted free like a greased snake and scrambled toward Nesotavo, her small size allowing her to duck under Dutch's desperate grab. "Kill them all," Dutch screamed, abandoning any pretense of negotiation for pure vengeance. But before the surviving bounty hunters could carry out their leader's final order, another complication arrived at the canyon mouth. The disciplined sound of cavalry approaching at military pace. Lieutenant Marcus Cole's patrol had finally arrived, drawn by reports of gunfire and Indian raids threatening territorial peace. The young officer's crisp voice carried over the chaos with unmistakable authority. "This is the United States Army. All hostile parties will lay down their arms immediately and prepare to be taken into custody." The canyon suddenly became a three-way standoff of the most dangerous kind. Cheyenne warriors held the high ground, but faced military carbines designed for exactly this kind of engagement. Dutch's surviving men were trapped between all parties, their professional competence useless in such circumstances. And in the middle, a wounded warrior protected a child, while bullets began to fly from multiple directions. Lieutenant Cole, Sheriff Sykes, called from his position near the canyon mouth, recognizing an opportunity to regain control of the narrative. That child is evidence in a criminal case, key witness to theft and treason charges against her family. Cole's head turned toward Sykes, his military training warring with growing suspicion about the sheriff's version of events. The scene before him. Indians protecting a white child rather than harming her supposed lawmen, shooting at defenders rather than attackers didn't match the reports he'd received. In that moment of divided attention, Dutch Kessler made his final desperate play. Recognizing that death was inevitable either way, he chose to go down fighting rather than face territorial justice. He raised his pistol toward Clara, who was helping bind Nesotavo's wound with strips of cloth torn from her dress. End of the line. Dutch snarled, his gold tooth glinting as he bared his teeth in a final grimace of rage and defiance. Three things happened simultaneously, each one changing the trajectory of everything that followed. Makah's arrow took Dutch through the chest with the precision of a master archer, the steel point punching through bone and heart with surgical accuracy. The bounty hunter's eyes widened with surprise and disbelief before he toppled backward into the pool, his blood mixing with Billy Santos's in the clear mountain water. At almost the same instant, Sheriff Sykes fired at Nesotavo's back from his concealed position, the bullet missing by mere inches, but revealing his true intent to everyone present. The shot was clearly aimed to kill, not capture, and Lieutenant Cole's military training immediately recognized an assassination attempt when he saw one. And as if triggered by the gunfire itself, the cave ceiling began to collapse as stray bullets struck structural weaknesses that had been gradually deteriorating for decades. The sound started as a low rumble like distant thunder, then grew to a roar as tons of stone began their inevitable slide toward the canyon floor. Arrest Sheriff Sykes. Lieutenant Cole commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos with military authority. Sergeant Murphy, if he resists, shoot him. You can't arrest me. Sykes protested, spinning toward the cavalry with wild eyes. I'm the law here. I'm trying to stop an Indian raid. Not anymore, you're not. Cole replied grimly, his young face set with the determination of someone who had just witnessed the corruption he'd only heard rumors about. The only raid I see here is yours. But their confrontation was interrupted by the mountain itself expressing its opinion. The gunfight had weakened stone supports that had held for centuries, and now physics was demanding payment for the violence done in this sacred place. With a rumble like distant thunder growing steadily louder, the entire cave structure began its inexorable collapse. Everyone out. Cole shouted, recognizing the danger, even as he maintained his weapon trained on Sykes. The whole canyon's coming down. Warriors and soldiers alike scrambled for safety as boulders the size of houses began to fall from above. Horses screamed and reared as their riders fought to control panicked animals on ground that shook like an earthquake. The waterfall itself was being buried under avalanche debris, its silver flow interrupted and redirected by the crushing weight of falling stone. But Nesotavo and Clara were trapped at the cave's back wall, cut off from the entrance by a curtain of falling rock that made escape impossible. The ancient pictographs that had told stories for generations disappeared under tons of mesa stone, their painted wisdom buried along with everything else. Nesotavo gathered Clara close with his good arm, feeling the vibration of destruction through stone and bone. Around them, scattered papers evidence of Sykes's corruption that had survived both gunfight and betrayal, fluttered like dying butterflies in the dusty air stirred by collapsing stone. Are we going to die? Clara asked with the directness that children sometimes show in the face of ultimate crisis, her voice surprisingly calm despite the chaos surrounding them. I don't know. Nesotavo replied honestly, blood from his shoulder wound dripping onto her blonde hair. But if we do, we die together. You are not alone, Clara. Whatever happens next, you are not alone. The mountain fell upon them both, burying truth and lies together in Wyoming stone justice and corruption equally covered by the impartial weight of geological inevitability. But death, it seemed, had miscalculated its reach. When consciousness slowly returned, Nesotavo found himself in what could only be described as a miracle of physics and fortune. The avalanche that should have crushed them had instead created a pocket of survival, a natural arch of fallen stones that had deflected the crushing weight like the ribs of some massive stone cathedral. Thin shafts of daylight filtered down through gaps in the debris, creating a dim but livable twilight in their rocky prison. The air was thick with dust that made breathing difficult, but it was breathable air nonetheless. Somewhere in the jumbled stone, water still flowed. The underground spring that fed the cave's pools had found new channels through the debris, creating the soft sound of running water that meant survival rather than death. Clara lay beside him, her breathing steady and her limbs intact, protected by his body from the worst of the falling stone. She woke to his gentle touch, blinking in the filtered light that transformed their stone tomb into something almost mystical. "We're buried," she observed with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children sometimes show in situations that would drive adults to panic. Yes, but we are alive. Nesotavo replied, testing his wounded shoulder gingerly. The bleeding had stopped, though movement sent fresh waves of pain through his arm. And where there is life, there is hope. Listen, Clara said, tilting her head toward the sounds filtering down through the debris. From above came the unmistakable sounds of rescue in progress, shovels scraping against stone, voices calling in both English and Cheyenne, the organized effort of people working together toward a common goal. The survivors of the canyon battle were cooperating to reach them, differences temporarily set aside in the face of shared humanity. Anyone alive down there? Lieutenant Cole's voice echoed through the jumbled rocks, distorted but unmistakably hopeful. 2 survivors. Nesotavo called back, his voice hoarse from dust and effort. The child is safe and unharmed. Hold on, came the reply. We're digging you out. It's going to take time, but we're not giving up. What they couldn't see was the remarkable scene unfolding above ground. Sheriff Sykes sat with his hands bound behind his back, guarded by grim-faced cavalry troopers, while Sergeant Murphy methodically collected evidence of his crimes. The corrupt lawman's empire had collapsed as completely as the cave that had sheltered his intended victims. More surprisingly, Maka knelt beside the rescue site, his war paint streaked with dust and sweat, as he helped move stones by hand alongside the very soldiers he had been fighting minutes earlier. The philosophical differences between brothers seemed insignificant compared to the immediate imperative of saving lives. My brother still breathes, he reported to Lieutenant Cole, his English careful but clear. But they are buried deep. This will take many hours of digging. Then we dig for many hours. Cole replied without hesitation, his military bearing softened by genuine concern. No one dies on my watch if I can prevent it, regardless of their race or the circumstances that brought us here. The rescue operation continued through the day and into the night, illuminated by cavalry torches and Cheyenne fire sticks that cast dancing shadows on stone walls. Men who had been enemies worked side by side, passing rocks from hand to hand in a human chain that gradually carved a path toward the trapped pair. Clara and Nesotavo waited in their stone shelter, sharing water that seeped through cracks in the debris and the last of the dried meat from his pack. To pass time and keep fear at bay, they talked about small things, favorite foods, childhood memories, the way different seasons smelled in their respective homelands. Well, when we get out, Clara said, as they listened to the steady rhythm of digging above, what will happen to us? I don't know. Nesotavo admitted, understanding the complexity of their situation. Your world and mine follow different laws, answer to different authorities. But whatever happens, I will not abandon you. That is a promise I make before all the spirits of my ancestors. Even if it gets you in trouble, especially then. Promises mean nothing if we only keep them when they're convenient. He touched her face gently with his uninjured hand. You saved my life today, Clara. When Dutch had his knife to your throat, you could have been paralyzed with fear. Instead, you used your mind to escape. That was very brave. I was scared, she admitted quietly. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what needs to be done despite being scared. And what you did going limp like that, then running when you had the chance, that was warrior thinking. Clara was quiet for a moment, processing this new understanding of courage. Nesotavo, can I ask you something about dying? The question made his heart ache, but he nodded. Ask whatever you need to know. In your people's beliefs, what happens when we die? Do we see our families again? It was a profound question from a child who had lost everything, and Nesotavo chose his words carefully. We believe that spirits return to the Creator, that all beings are connected in the great circle of existence. Death is not an ending, but a transformation. Like water becoming vapor and then rain. So if we had died down here, I might have seen Mama and Papa again. Perhaps. But I also believe that we were meant to survive this, Clara. That there is still work for us to do in this world, still good we are meant to accomplish together. What kind of work? The kind your father started building something better, proving that people of different backgrounds can work together for common good. Your family's mind could become a place where that happens, where trust replaces fear. As dawn broke overhead, the diggers finally broke through the last layer of debris. Sunlight streamed down through the rescue shaft like a golden ladder, and Clara squinted up at faces looking down cavalry blue and Cheyenne brown, all showing relief and exhaustion from their long night's work. Time to come home. Maka called down his voice gentle for the first time since their reunion, the anger temporarily replaced by concern for his brother's welfare. But as rope ladders dropped toward them and willing hands prepared to pull them to safety, Clara faced a profound realization that struck her with adult clarity. Despite her 8 years, she had no home in any traditional sense. Her family was dead, her house burned her past, erased by corruption and violence. The future stretched ahead like unmarked territory on a map. Yet looking at Miss Otavo's scarred face, marked by battle but softened by protective love, that had never wavered, even in the face of death, she understood something her parents had tried to teach her. Home wasn't always a place with walls and a roof. Sometimes it was a person who chose to stand between you and darkness, who made keeping you safe more important than keeping themselves alive. The rescue was complete, but their real journey was just beginning. 2 weeks later, Red Mesa looked like a town waking from a fever dream that had lasted too long. Sheriff Sykes sat in his own jail cell, his former kingdom reduced to iron bars and straw bedding, awaiting transport to territorial prison, where he would face charges that reached far beyond simple land grabbing. His surviving deputies occupied neighboring cells, their badges replaced with shackles, and their future measured in decades behind bars. Lieutenant Cole had assumed temporary civil authority, appointing honest citizens to maintain order, while territorial investigators sorted through evidence that painted a picture of corruption deeper and more systematic than anyone had imagined. The papers Clara had preserved, combined with testimony from townspeople who finally felt safe to speak the truth, revealed a network of fraud that had infected the territory like a cancer. Miss Otavo's shoulder wound was healing cleanly under the care of an army surgeon who had expected to treat a savage, but instead found a man who understood anatomy and field medicine better than many trained doctors. The bullet had missed major arteries, and bone and proper cleaning had prevented the infection that killed more frontier fighters than enemy weapons. You could have been a healer instead of a warrior, the doctor observed while changing bandages in the makeshift hospital tent that had been erected behind the jail. Among my people there is no meaningful difference, Miss Otavo replied, wincing as antiseptic burned the healing wound. Both protect life, both serve the continuation of the people. A warrior who cannot heal is incomplete. Clara stayed close to her protector, despite well-meaning attempts by various townspeople and territorial officials to place her with proper Christian families who could provide appropriate guidance for a young lady of her station. She had seen too much lost, too much to trust easily, no matter how kind the intentions or generous the offers. The question of her future remained officially unresolved until the morning when Territorial Marshal Thomas Garrett arrived from Cheyenne City. He came with a leather portfolio full of legal documents and a stern expression that suggested he carried news of considerable importance. Miss Winslow, the marshal said, settling into a chair across from Clara in the hotel room that had become their temporary sanctuary. I have some papers here that might be of considerable interest to you and your current situation. From his portfolio came documents that made Clara's eyes widen with recognition and wonder. Her father's mining claim, properly registered and legally owned according to territorial law, had been restored to her by official decree. Recent geological surveys conducted after reports of the region's gold potential revealed that the Winslow claim sat atop one of the richest veins in the entire valley system. You're quite a wealthy young lady, Miss Winslow. Marshal Garrett continued, his official voice softening slightly as he addressed a child who had endured more than most adults could imagine. The question that now faces us is what you want to do about that wealth and who you trust to help you manage it properly. Clara looked around the crowded room at the marshal with his official papers and legal authority, at the territorial officials with their carefully prepared plans for her future, at Lieutenant Cole with his military bearing and genuine concern, at the well-meaning townspeople who suddenly showed her respect, tinged with nervous awareness of her new financial status. Then her gaze settled on Nesotavo, who stood quietly by the window, prepared to accept whatever decision she made about their shared future, ready to step aside, if that was what was best for her. "I want to stay with him," she said simply, taking the warrior's uninjured hand in both of hers. "He's my family now. He's the only family I have left, and I'm the only family he has left." The room erupted in discussion about propriety and civilization, about what was appropriate for a young white girl, and what society would think about such an unusual arrangement. But Clara had learned to speak with the clear voice of someone who had faced death and found courage in the darkness. "I won't leave him," she declared, her blue eyes blazing with determination that reminded everyone present of her father's stubborn honesty and her mother's quiet strength. "He saved me when nobody else would help. He protected me when everyone else was afraid. He's teaching me things I need to know to survive in this world." She paused, then delivered the words that silenced all argument and captured the essential truth of their bond. "My mama always said family isn't just about blood. It's about who chooses to love you when loving you is dangerous, who stands by you when standing by you costs them everything they have." One of the territorial officials, a well-dressed man with the soft hands of someone who had never done hard labor, cleared his throat nervously. "Miss Winslow, surely you understand that there are considerations of civilization to think about. A proper Christian upbringing, suitable education preparation for your eventual role in respectable society. What's respectable about letting children get murdered because you're afraid to stand up to corrupt men?" Clara shot back with a directness that made several adults flinch. "Nesotavo did what was right when everyone else did what was safe. That sounds like the most Christian thing anyone did in this whole terrible mess." Marshal Garrett studied the unlikely pair for a long moment, and the Cheyenne warrior with his quiet dignity and obvious devotion to the child's welfare, and the white girl with her fierce loyalty to the man who had risked everything to protect her. What he saw was not the scandal that others feared, but a bond forged in shared suffering and mutual protection that transcended the racial prejudices of their time. "The law requires proper documentation for guardianship arrangements," he said finally, his official voice carrying the weight of territorial authority. "Miss Winslow legally owns her claim and has the right to choose her guardian within reasonable parameters. The question is whether Mr. He paused, struggling with the Cheyenne name. "You may call me Nathan," Nesotavo said in English, choosing a name that honored both his heritage and his new role in Clara's life. "Nathan standing alone." "Very well. Nathan standing alone. Are you prepared to accept the legal responsibilities of guardianship for this child and the considerable assets she has inherited?" The warrior looked down at Clara, seeing not a burden, but a blessing, a chance to protect innocence in a world that too often destroyed it before it could flourish, an opportunity to succeed where he had failed before. "I accept those responsibilities," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of sacred promise. The territorial official who had spoken earlier was not finished with his objections. "Marshal Garrett, surely you can't be serious about this arrangement. The social implications alone, a white girl raised by an Indian, exposed to heathen beliefs and savage customs. What will become of her moral development, her prospects for suitable marriage?" Marshal Garrett's expression hardened as he turned to face the official. Mr. Henderson, in the past 2 weeks, I have reviewed extensive evidence of Sheriff Sykes's criminal activities. I have read testimonies from townspeople describing years of corruption, intimidation, and theft. I have examined financial records showing systematic fraud that enriched Sykes and his cronies at the expense of honest settlers. He gestured toward Nesotavo with obvious respect. And in all of that documentation, in all of those testimonies, the only person who acted with consistent honor and courage was this man. The only person who put a child's welfare above his own safety was this savage you're so concerned about. The marshal's voice rose slightly, carrying the authority of someone who had seen too much frontier corruption to tolerate more of it. So, when you ask me about moral development and Christian values, I suggest you look at actions rather than skin color. I suggest you consider which example Clara should follow: the civilized sheriff, who murdered her family for gold, or the heathen warrior, who nearly died protecting her from those same civilized men. The room fell silent as the weight of that truth settled over everyone present. Clara squeezed Nesotavo's hand, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun streaming through the hotel windows. But the final surprise came when Clara reached beneath her dress and produced something that no one had noticed during all the chaos of recent days: a small silver locket that had belonged to her mother. With careful fingers, she opened it to reveal not just the family photograph everyone expected, but a second compartment containing a carefully folded paper that made Marshal Garrett's eyebrows rise toward his hairline. "What is it?" Lieutenant Cole asked, leaning closer to examine the document that seemed to have captured the marshal's complete attention. "A letter," Garrett replied with growing amazement, unfolding the paper with a reverence due to something precious. Written in Robert Winslow's hand, properly witnessed and dated just 3 weeks before his death. The letter was addressed to Marshal Garrett himself, written in the careful script of a man who understood the importance of clear communication. As Garrett read aloud, the words painted a picture of a father's foresight and a careful man's preparation for disaster. Marshal Garrett, if you are reading this, then the worst has happened to my family. I write this letter as insurance against the corruption I see growing in Red Mesa, specifically the actions of Sheriff Sykes, who has demanded I surrender my legally obtained mining claim through means of intimidation and false accusations. Should anything happen to me and my wife, I hereby request that you ensure my daughter Clara's welfare according to my wishes. I have observed the character of a Cheyenne trader named Nesotavo, who has shown fairness and honor in all our dealings. Unlike many others in this territory, he judges men by their actions rather than their race, and he treats all people with dignity regardless of their station. I have seen him risk his own safety to help others, and I believe him to be a man of unshakable integrity. If I am not alive to protect my daughter, I can think of no one I would trust more to ensure her safety and moral development. He understands the value of honest work and the importance of protecting the innocent qualities that seem increasingly rare among those who claim to represent civilization and Christian values. Enclosed, you will find documentation of Sykes's fraudulent activities, which I hope will serve as evidence should you need to pursue justice. But my primary concern is Clara's future, and I believe that future will be brighter in the care of a man who chooses honor over profit, courage over safety. Respectfully yours, Robert Winslow. The silence that followed this reading was profound and transformative. Every objection, every concern about propriety and social convention seemed petty in the face of a father's carefully considered judgment about who could be trusted with his daughter's life. Your father was indeed a careful man, Marshal Garrett said, finally refolding the letter with obvious respect. He saw corruption growing around him and prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. His judgment appears to have been remarkably accurate. And so it was that Clara Winslow became the legal ward of Nathan Standing Alone, her guardianship established not through charity or accident, but through the deliberate choice of a father who had recognized honor when he saw it and trusted in character over convention. 3 months later, the Lucky Strike claim had been transformed into something unprecedented in the territory. A cooperative mining operation that employed both white settlers and Cheyenne workers at equal wages, with profits shared according to contribution rather than skin color. The gold vein proved even richer than the surveys had suggested, but more importantly, the partnership had produced something rarer than precious metal proof that cooperation could succeed where conflict had brought only suffering. Clara attended school in Red Mesa 3 days each week, learning reading, writing, and arithmetic from a teacher imported from Denver, specifically to handle her education. The other 4 days were spent with Nathan's people, learning traditional skills and the deep wisdom of those who had lived on this land for countless generations. She spoke both English and Cheyenne, now her blonde hair often braided with traditional beads, while wearing clothing that mixed settler and native styles in ways that reflected her unique position between two worlds. Some townspeople still whispered about the arrangement, but they whispered quietly. Clara had grown into someone who commanded respect through both wealth and character, and her success was hard to argue with. On a clear morning, exactly 1 year after the hangings that had changed everything, Clara and Nathan stood on a hill overlooking their thriving operation. Below them, men of different backgrounds worked side by side. Their children played together without regard for skin color or language spoken at home, and the sound of honest labor filled the air with purpose and hope. "Do you think Papa would be proud of what we've built?" Clara asked, watching a group of Cheyenne and white children race stick horses around the mining camp with shrieks of laughter. "I think your father would be amazed." Nathan replied, his arm around her shoulders as they surveyed the community they had created. He dreamed of a place where honest work was rewarded fairly. "You've built something even better, a place where honest work brings people together instead of driving them apart." Clara leaned against his solid strength, feeling the security that had grown from shared trials and mutual trust. The rope scars on her wrists had faded to thin white lines, barely visible unless you knew to look for them, but they served as permanent reminders of the day death had reached for her and been turned away by unexpected courage. "Then," she said, using his chosen English name with the ease of long familiarity, "do you think we'll always be family?" "Always," he replied without hesitation, his voice carrying the weight of sacred promise. "Blood may make relatives, but choice makes family. And I choose you, Clara, standing alone for as long as the sun rises in the east and the mountains stand against the sky." She smiled at the name he had given her, not Clara Winslow anymore, but Clara, standing alone, daughter by choice, to a man who had stood alone against injustice and found that he was no longer alone at all. In the distance, a new group of travelers approached their camp families, seeking honest work and fair treatment, drawn by stories of a place where such things were still possible, in a territory too often ruled by greed and violence. Clara and Nathan walked down to greet them together, ready to offer what had been offered to them in their darkest hour: hope, protection, and the chance to build something better from the ashes of what had been lost. The hanging tree still stood at the edge of Red Mesa, but now it bore different fruit, a simple wooden sign that read, "Here died 3 innocents. In their memory, we choose justice over convenience, truth over profit." Clara had insisted on the memorial, wanting the world to remember that corruption could be defeated when good people chose to act, rather than simply hoping someone else would solve the problem. The last witness had become the first hope for a different kind of future, where honor mattered more than heritage and courage counted for more than convention. In a territory where such victories were rare and precious, theirs was a story worth telling, and more importantly, worth living every single day. And in the end, that commitment to living their values, rather than simply talking about them, had made all the difference.